My name is Camille Farrow. I'm 32. For 6 years, my family had one running joke at every holiday gathering. My sister is a doctor, and I'm just a waitress. Last Thanksgiving, my mother introduced me to my aunt's new boyfriend with those exact words. This is Camille, she waits tables downtown, while my sister stood beside her, freshly introduced as Dr. Renata Farrow, cardiology. I'd cooked the entire Thanksgiving dinner that year, the same as I had for 6 years running. I'd also, quietly, been managing something about my career that none of them knew existed. I stood up from that table, and what I said next changed the way my entire family understood who I actually was. Before I tell you what I said, let me take you back to where this joke actually started, because 6 years of being reduced to a punchline doesn't happen without a specific beginning. If you're the kind of person who watches these stories all the way through, go ahead and subscribe, only if you genuinely mean it. Drop your city and local time in the comments, I read every one. I grew up in Wilmington, Delaware, the older of 2 daughters. My father, Gino, ran a small landscaping business. My mother, Paula, worked as a receptionist at a family medical practice for over 20 years. My younger sister, Renata, 29, had always been the academically gifted one, valedictorian, full scholarship to a state university, then medical school, then a cardiology residency that had, by the time of that Thanksgiving, resolved into an attending position at a well-regarded hospital in Philadelphia. I'd taken a different path, one that had never quite earned the same respect within my family, despite representing years of deliberate, strategic effort of my own. After a hospitality management degree from a state college, I'd started working front of house at an upscale restaurant in Wilmington at 23, initially as exactly what my family assumed, a server, tips-based income, evening shifts that didn't align with the traditional markers of professional success my parents valued. What my family never fully understood, because I'd never found the right moment to explain it clearly, was how deliberately that starting position had actually been a first step in a much longer plan. Within 18 months, I'd moved from serving tables to managing the floor. By 26, I was assistant general manager. By 28, I'd been recruited to open and run an entirely new restaurant concept for a regional hospitality group, a role that came with an ownership stake, not just a salary, structured specifically to reward the person willing to build the concept from the ground up. By the time of that Thanksgiving, at 32, I held a 12% equity stake in a restaurant that had, over the preceding 3 years, expanded into 2 additional locations, with a 4th in development. My annual income, between salary and profit distributions, had quietly surpassed my sister's attending physician salary the previous year, a fact I'd never mentioned at any family gathering, partly out of genuine humility, and partly, I'll admit now, out of a kind of protective instinct, wanting to see if my family would ever value what I'd built on its own merits, without needing the validation of a specific dollar figure to make it real to them. They never did. Every holiday, every family gathering, the same dynamic repeated itself with a consistency that started to feel less like an oversight and more like a deliberate family mythology everyone had simply agreed to maintain. Renata was introduced with her full title, her hospital affiliation, updates about her latest research publication. I was introduced, when I was introduced with any specificity at all, as the Waitress, a title that had technically been accurate 9 years earlier and had never been updated since, despite everything that had changed in the years between. I'd tried, a few times over those years, to correct the record directly. At my cousin's wedding 3 years earlier, I'd mentioned, during a toast, that I now managed operations for the restaurant group rather than serving tables. My mother had laughed and said, "Oh, Camille's being modest, she still helps out on the floor sometimes," a correction that somehow made the situation worse rather than better, reframing my actual professional advancement as some kind of humble side activity I engaged in for fun. I stopped correcting them after that. Some part of me, I think, had quietly decided that if they weren't going to actually listen when I explained my real career, I wasn't going to keep expending the emotional energy required to make them listen. I focused instead on building the business itself, on proving something to myself rather than to a family dynamic that seemed entirely uninterested in updating its assumptions. Every Thanksgiving, despite everything, I still hosted. It had become tradition somewhere along the way. Camille cooks, Camille manages the logistics, Camille coordinates who's bringing what, while everyone else arrives and settles into a meal I'd spent 2 full days preparing, using skills and organizational systems I'd actually developed professionally, running commercial kitchens for a living. Last Thanksgiving, I'd spent that Wednesday and Thursday morning managing not just the family dinner, but also, quietly, a genuine business crisis, a walk-in refrigeration failure at my newest restaurant location that threatened nearly $4,000 in perishable inventory, resolved only through 2 hours of frantic calls to emergency repair services and a temporary product transfer between locations, all handled between basting the turkey and mashing potatoes for 11 family members. None of them knew any of that had happened. I'd handled it the way I handled everything at that point, quietly, efficiently, without expecting anyone at that table to understand or acknowledge the actual scope of what I managed on a daily basis. By the time everyone arrived that afternoon, I'd showered off the stress of the refrigeration crisis, changed into a simple green blouse, and greeted my extended family with the same practiced warmth I'd maintained through 6 years of holidays that consistently diminished exactly what I'd built. My Aunt Priscilla arrived with a new boyfriend, Walter, someone none of us had met before. My mother made the introductions in the entryway, guiding Walter through the family with the easy confidence of someone who'd delivered these exact lines dozens of times before. "This is my daughter Renata," she said, gesturing warmly. "She's a cardiologist at Presbyterian in Philadelphia. Absolutely brilliant, we're so proud of her." Then, turning slightly toward me, still holding a serving spoon I'd need to get back to the stuffing, my mother added, "And this is Camille. She waits tables downtown." Walter nodded politely, already turning his attention back toward Renata, the conversation naturally flowing past me the way it always did in that particular script, toward the daughter whose profession warranted actual elaboration. I stood there for a moment, holding a serving spoon in a kitchen I'd spent 2 days organizing, having just resolved a $4,000 equipment crisis before anyone else had even arrived, described to a stranger as someone who waits tables downtown, as though nothing about my life had changed in 9 years. I set the spoon down slowly, walked into the dining room where everyone was settling around the table I'd set that morning, and said something I'd never said at any family gathering before. "Actually," I said, my voice steadier than I expected, "I think it's time everyone at this table actually knew what I do for a living." The room quieted in that specific way rooms do when someone breaks a pattern everyone had silently agreed never to interrupt. My father looked up from the drink he was pouring. Renata, seated beside our uncle, set down her water glass. "Camille, is everything all right?" my mother asked, still holding the serving spoon I'd left in the kitchen doorway, following me into the dining room with visible confusion. "Everything's fine. I just think it's strange that everyone here knows exactly what Renata's professional title is, down to her hospital affiliation, and most of you don't actually know what I do, beyond a job title I haven't held in almost 9 years. You wait tables," my mother said, more confused than defensive, as though I were correcting something trivial. "You've always waited tables." "I haven't waited tables since I was 23, Mom. I manage restaurant operations for a hospitality group. I hold a 12% equity stake in the restaurant I helped build from the ground up. We're opening a 4th location next spring. I resolved an equipment failure worth almost $4,000 in inventory 2 hours before any of you arrived today, while also cooking this entire dinner, and I did that quietly, the same way I've quietly managed everything about my career for the past 9 years. Because every time I've tried to explain it, someone at this table corrects me back into being the waitress within about 30 seconds. The table was fully silent now. My father set down the bottle he'd been holding. Renata's expression had shifted into something I couldn't immediately read, surprise, mostly, though something more complicated moved beneath it. 12% equity, my father repeated slowly. "Camille, what does that actually mean, dollar-wise?" I hesitated for a moment, some old instinct telling me to deflect, to minimize, to keep the peace the way I'd kept it for 9 years. Then I decided, deliberately, not to. "It means my income last year was higher than Renata's attending salary." Not because her work isn't valuable, it absolutely is, and I've never once diminished what she does. But I've spent 9 years building something real, something I'm genuinely proud of, and I've watched this family reduce it to a punchline at every single gathering because none of you ever bothered to ask a follow-up question. My Aunt Priscilla's boyfriend, Walter, looked distinctly uncomfortable, clearly wishing he'd arrived to a quieter family dynamic than the one he'd just walked into. My mother set the serving spoon down on the table, her expression cycling through something between shock and a kind of dawning, uncomfortable recognition. "Camille, I didn't know," she said. "You never told us any of this directly." "I tried, Mom. 3 years ago, at Aaron's wedding, I mentioned I'd moved into operations management. You told everyone I was being modest, that I still helped out on the floor sometimes. I stopped correcting the record after that, because it felt like nothing I said actually changed how this family had decided to see me." Renata spoke for the first time since I'd walked into the room, her voice quieter than usual. "Camille, I didn't know about any of this either. I feel like an idiot right now, honestly. I've been the one everyone asks about at every family thing, and I never once thought to ask what you'd actually built, because I just assumed the joke was accurate." "It hasn't been accurate for 9 years, Renata. I'm not angry at you specifically. I think this whole family just settled into a story about who I was a long time ago, and nobody's bothered to update it since. Including me, because I got tired of trying." My father stood up from the table, walked over to where I was standing, and did something he hadn't done in longer than I could remember. He hugged me, tightly, in a way that felt more like an apology than any words could have managed. "I'm sorry, Camille. I genuinely didn't understand what you'd built. I think I stopped paying close attention to your career a long time ago, and I let an old joke fill in the gaps instead of actually asking real questions." Dinner that evening proceeded differently than any Thanksgiving I could remember. My mother, visibly working to recalibrate years of assumptions in real time, asked actual questions about the restaurant group, about the equity structure, about what a typical day actually looked like for me. My Aunt Priscilla, once she understood the actual scope of what I'd built, spent nearly 20 minutes asking detailed questions about the fourth location's opening timeline, genuinely curious in a way that felt entirely different from the polite, surface-level interest she'd always directed toward Renata's medical career. Renata pulled me aside during dessert, into the kitchen where I'd handled the refrigeration crisis just hours earlier. "Camille, I need to say something directly. I think, without ever meaning to, I benefited from this family's assumption that my path was more legitimate than yours, and I never once challenged that, because it was comfortable for me not to. I'm sorry for the part one played in that, even if I didn't create the dynamic myself." "I appreciate you saying that," I told her. "I've never resented your success, Renata. What I resented was watching this family treat my success as something that needed explaining or excusing, while yours got celebrated automatically, without question." "That's fair," she said. "That's completely fair, and I think I need to sit with that for a while." I drove home that night, after helping clean up a kitchen I knew better than anyone else at that table, feeling something I hadn't expected to feel after finally saying the thing I'd been holding back for 9 years. Not triumph exactly, but a kind of quiet relief, the specific relief of finally being seen accurately by people who'd spent years looking at an outdated version of who I actually was. The weeks following that Thanksgiving unfolded differently than I expected. I'd assumed, honestly, that the conversation at the table would fade back into old patterns within a month or two, that my family's genuine surprise would settle back into the comfortable, familiar joke once the initial shock wore off. Instead, something more lasting seemed to shift. My mother called me 2 weeks later, her voice carrying a tentative curiosity I wasn't used to hearing directed at my career. "Camille, I've been thinking about what you said at Thanksgiving. I want to actually understand what you do. Would you be willing to show me the restaurant sometime? Not just visit as a customer. I mean actually show me how it works." I agreed, somewhat cautiously, still uncertain whether this represented genuine change or a temporary overcorrection that would fade once the discomfort of that dinner receded further into memory. My mother visited the flagship location on a Tuesday afternoon, during a quieter service window, and I walked her through the operation with the same detail I'd give any serious visitor: the kitchen workflow, the inventory systems I'd built, the staff scheduling software I'd implemented that had reduced labor costs by nearly 18% in the first year alone, the relationship management with our produce suppliers that ensured consistency across all 3 current locations. She was quiet for most of the walkthrough, absorbing details I could tell she'd never considered before, watching me interact with staff members who clearly respected my authority in a way that seemed to genuinely surprise her. "Camille," she said finally, sitting across from me at a corner table after the tour, "I think I owe you a real apology, not just the one I gave at the table that night. I think I looked at you for years and saw a job title from when you were 23, and I never once asked myself whether that title still fit the person you'd actually become. That's not fair to you, and I'm sorry it took an uncomfortable dinner for me to finally look properly." "Thank you for saying that," I told her. I think what hurt most wasn't just the joke itself. It was watching this family ask genuine, curious questions about Renata's life constantly, while treating mine as settled, finished, not worth further investigation. "I built something real, Mom, and I built it specifically because I wanted to prove something to myself, not because I needed anyone's validation. But it still would have meant something, along the way, to have someone actually ask real questions instead of assuming they already knew the whole story." My father's shift came more gradually, expressed less through direct conversation and more through small, consistent gestures over the following months, asking specific questions about the 4th location's opening, requesting to see the space once construction began, mentioning my career, unprompted, to his own friends in a way relatives later told me they'd noticed and found genuinely surprising given his previous silence on the subject. Renata and I, unexpectedly, grew closer during that period than we'd been in years. She called more often, genuinely curious about aspects of my work that had nothing to do with proving anything to our parents, asking about the psychology of running a kitchen team, about how I'd learned to manage the specific pressures of hospitality operations, questions that felt like real sisterly curiosity rather than obligatory family small talk. I think I spent so many years being the family's designated success story that I never had to develop real curiosity about anyone else's path, she told me during one of those calls. "It's easier to be curious about someone once you stop needing them to be less impressive than you, even if you never consciously thought about it that way before." The 4th restaurant location opened the following spring, and my entire family attended the opening night, not as an afterthought squeezed between other obligations, but as a genuine celebration my parents had specifically cleared their calendar to attend. My mother, during the toast I gave that evening, stood up unprompted and added her own remarks, something she'd never done at any professional milestone of mine before. "I want everyone here to know," she said, her voice carrying across the private dining room we'd reserved for the opening, "that my daughter built this entire business from nothing, starting as a server 9 years ago, working her way into ownership through sheer determination and skill that I, frankly, didn't fully appreciate until far too recently. I'm incredibly proud of her, and I'm sorry it took me this long to say so this clearly." I felt something settle in my chest that evening, watching my mother speak with genuine pride about the exact career path she'd spent 9 years reducing to a punchline, understanding that whatever had shifted at that Thanksgiving table hadn't been temporary after all. Aunt Priscilla, still with Walter nearly a year later, made a point of introducing me at the next family gathering with careful, deliberate accuracy. "This is my niece Camille," she said, to a new coworker she'd brought along. "She's a partner in a restaurant group, opened her 4th location this spring. Absolutely brilliant businesswoman, we're all so proud of her." I caught my mother's eye across the room as Priscilla made that introduction, and something passed between us, an acknowledgement, unspoken, of exactly how far the family's language about my life had traveled since that Thanksgiving dinner where a serving spoon had been the only thing I'd been holding when someone finally described me accurately for the first time in 9 years. Not every relationship in my family shifted as smoothly as the ones with my parents and Renata. My cousin Danny, Priscilla's son, had spent years leaning into the family joke more aggressively than anyone else, treating it as an easy source of comedic material at every gathering, oblivious or indifferent to how it landed. At a family barbecue that following summer, Danny made the joke again, out of old habit, introducing me to his new girlfriend with the same tired line the rest of the family had already abandoned. This is Camille, she's basically been waiting tables since before I could drive. The room went quiet in a different way than it had at Thanksgiving, not shocked silence, but the particular awkward quiet of people who'd already collectively moved past a joke watching someone else fail to notice the shift. Actually, Danny, my mother said, before I could respond myself, Camille's a partner in a restaurant group. She opened her 4th location this spring. I'd appreciate it if you updated your material. Danny looked genuinely confused, glancing between me and my mother, clearly having missed the entire recalibration that had happened within the family over the preceding months. Wait, seriously, since when? Since about 9 years ago, actually, I said. You've just never asked. Danny apologized, a little sheepishly, clearly embarrassed at having been the one relative who hadn't absorbed the correction everyone else had internalized. It became, oddly, its own small marker of how thoroughly things had actually changed, the fact that continuing the old joke now felt jarring and out of step, rather than simply the expected, comfortable script it had been for 9 years running. The following Thanksgiving, exactly 1 year after the dinner that changed everything, I hosted again, the same tradition maintained, though the atmosphere surrounding it felt entirely different. My mother arrived early, insisting on helping with actual meal preparation rather than simply waiting to be served, asking genuine questions about the techniques I'd learned professionally that made certain dishes come together more efficiently than the methods she'd used for decades. When my Aunt Priscilla's boyfriend Walter, now fiancé, as it turned out, arrived that year, my mother made the introduction herself, unprompted, before I'd even had the chance to greet him at the door. Walter, this is my daughter Camille. She's a restaurant group partner, runs 4 locations across the region. She's cooking today's entire dinner using the same skills that built her career, which I think makes this the best Thanksgiving meal any of us will eat all year. Walter shook my hand warmly, no confusion in his expression this time, simply genuine interest in the woman his fiancé's family had apparently spent the past year learning to properly celebrate. I stood in my kitchen that evening, plating the same dishes I'd prepared for 6 years running, listening to my family's conversation drift naturally toward my career alongside Renata's, both discussed with equal curiosity and pride for what felt like the first time in longer than I could remember. Renata found me alone in the kitchen partway through the evening, helping plate desserts with a genuine skill she'd clearly been practicing since our conversation the previous year. I've been thinking about something, she said. All those years, I never once wondered why you always hosted, why you always cooked, why you always managed every logistical detail of this family's biggest gathering, even while everyone treated your actual career like an afterthought. I think part of me assumed that's just who you were, the reliable one, the one who handled things quietly without needing recognition. I don't think I ever considered that maybe you deserved recognition anyway, precisely because you were doing all of that without ever asking for credit. I appreciate you thinking about that, I told her. I think for years, I convinced myself I didn't need the recognition, that building something real was enough on its own. And it mostly was. But it also would have been nice, along the way, to have people actually see the whole picture instead of an outdated snapshot from when I was 23. You have that now, Renata said. For whatever it's worth, this whole family sees you clearly now, finally. I'm sorry it took this long. I've thought often, in the time since that original Thanksgiving, about how close I came to simply absorbing that comment about the waitress, the way I'd absorbed it for 6 years running before that, smiling politely, letting the moment pass, protecting the fragile peace of a family gathering rather than disrupting it with an uncomfortable truth nobody had asked to hear. What I've come to understand, watching the genuine shift that followed instead, is that the peace I'd been protecting for those 6 years had never actually been real peace at all. It had been a comfortable silence built entirely around my willingness to accept being seen incorrectly, in exchange for avoiding a few moments of awkwardness at a dinner table. The real peace, it turned out, existed on the other side of that discomfort, in a family that finally, genuinely understood exactly what I'd built, celebrated it alongside Renata's accomplishments rather than instead of them, and never again reduced 9 years of deliberate, careful work to a punchline that had stopped being accurate long before anyone bothered to notice. 2 years have passed since that original Thanksgiving, and the version of my family life now feels almost unrecognizable compared to the one I navigated for most of my adult career. The fourth restaurant location has become our highest performing site in the group, and I was recently promoted to a director-level operating role across the entire regional hospitality company, overseeing not just my original locations, but consulting on 2 additional restaurant concepts the company acquired last year. My mother knows all of this now, in real detail, because she asks. Not out of obligation, not as a corrective overcorrection to years of neglect, but because something genuine shifted in how she sees me, permanently, after that Thanksgiving dinner forced her to actually look. I got engaged this past spring, to a man named Julian I'd been dating for 2 years, someone who'd witnessed, secondhand, the entire arc of that family transformation and had commented, more than once, on how strange it was to watch a family recalibrate its entire understanding of a person in real time. My parents hosted our engagement party themselves, insisting on handling the catering personally rather than asking me to manage the logistics the way I'd managed every family gathering for the better part of a decade. It felt, in a way I hadn't expected, like its own quiet form of amends, my mother spending an entire Saturday in her own kitchen, determined to give me the experience of being celebrated rather than the one organizing the celebration, for what may have been the first time in either of our adult lives. I wanted you to just get to enjoy this one, she told me, setting down a tray of appetizers she'd spent all morning preparing. You've spent years making sure everyone else's gatherings ran smoothly. I wanted this one to be about you, without you having to lift a finger to make it happen. Renata gave a toast that evening that I still think about often, standing in my parents' backyard with a glass raised toward Julian and me, her voice carrying across a gathering that included, notably, an updated and accurate introduction of me to every single guest who hadn't already known the full story. I used to think Camille and I had very different lives, she said. One of us went to medical school, one of us went into hospitality. For years, this family treated those as unequal paths, and I'll admit, I never challenged that assumption as much as I should have. What I've learned over the past 2 years is that Camille built something just as demanding, just as skilled, just as worthy of genuine pride as anything I've built in medicine. She just built it quietly, without asking anyone's permission to be impressive, which honestly, might be the more remarkable accomplishment of the two. I cried during that toast, not from sadness, but from the specific, overwhelming relief of finally hearing my own family articulate, out loud, in front of people who mattered, exactly what I'd spent 9 years building without ever once hearing it validated so completely. Danny, my cousin, approached me near the end of that evening, drink in hand, looking slightly sheepish in a way that had become familiar since his misstep at the barbecue the previous summer. I want you to know, he said, I've actually been telling people about your restaurants. Like, unprompted, when people ask what my family does. I used to have this whole joke prepared about my cousin the waitress, and now I just tell people my cousin runs a restaurant empire, and honestly, it feels better to say it that way. It probably is better, I told him, smiling. Both because it's accurate, and because I imagine it's more interesting at parties than the old joke ever was. I think, sometimes, about the version of myself who stood in that kitchen that first Thanksgiving, holding a serving spoon, listening to my mother describe me to a stranger using a job title I hadn't held in 9 years. I think about how easy it would have been to simply set the spoon back down, return to the stuffing, and let that moment pass the way I'd let so many similar moments pass before it. What actually happened instead, the uncomfortable conversation, the months of gradual recalibration, the genuine, hard-won shift in how my family finally saw the entirety of who I'd become, required a kind of vulnerability I'd spent years avoiding, precisely because I'd convinced myself that building something real was enough on its own, that I didn't need anyone else's recognition to make my accomplishments legitimate. I still believe that's mostly true. What I've learned since, though, is that not needing recognition and deserving it aren't the same thing, and that sometimes the people who love you most simply need to be handed the accurate story directly, rather than being left to assume they already understand it, before they can finally offer you the recognition you'd quietly earned all along.